Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to look at a couple of things. First off, I'm going to look at where exactly your quote-unquote progressive entertainment is headed towards. And secondly, I'm going to look at a statement which is made in my comments over and over again, usually after I make one of these kinds of videos, saying, I have all of my old entertainment, I'm going to be satisfied with that, therefore I don't care what's going on right now. Is that going to be enough? Well, in this video, I'm going to play devil's advocate and say, no, it's not going to be enough. But before I get there, just a quick reminder that you can still order my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, directly through me. Therefore, if you missed the original campaign and wish to order one, just email me at rjs4thage@gmail.com and I can set you up from there. So first off, as I said, I want to take a look at where the quote-unquote progressive entertainment system is headed towards. Now, I'm not looking at any of the industry standards or where they're going to be making money or where they're losing money or anything like that. I'm looking at the purely ideological part of this entire thing, the quote-unquote progressive side, where the progressive people want to take this kind of entertainment. Because the true dyed-in-the-wool quote-unquote progressives who have now ensconced themselves in the making of entertainment really don't care whether or not they drive the vehicle that they're currently using into the ground, even to the extent whether they cause entire sections of the entertainment industry to be destroyed. They'll just do that in order to get their message out and then move on to the next vehicle. And I do believe that at the heart of what they're trying to do is a retcon of pretty much everything. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, retcon means retroactive continuity. And in story terms, it usually works where, in the current story, you insert a piece of history that fits into the older stories that have been told about this character or this world, and it fundamentally changes everything within that history in order to support the current story that you're writing. Now, in order to understand what they're trying to do with inserting retroactive continuity, we have to look at first their end point, where these people think they're going towards. And the whole reason why I say progressive is because they're trying to progress to something. They think that they can progress to a better society, usually a utopian-like society. It is very much, if not directly connected to, a socialist ideal of a golden age in the future. And if you want to put it in science fiction terms, it's people who believe that, yes, the Star Trek future is our future, we just have to get there. So, as I stated, this is directly connected to the fact that they call themselves progressives. And this is extremely important, because if you want to look logically and rationally about how people do things and what they are trying presently to do, what you're supposed to look at is the end point that these people wish to get to. Why? Because if you look at their current position and their end point, which they state they want to get to, all you got to do is connect those 2 points in order to see how exactly they're going to get there. And one other point to quickly make before I move on. Usually in my comments, people say, I'm giving way too much credit to these people. I'm thinking that there is this giant conspiracy and that they have it all connected and everything's working towards this fundamental end goal. No, that's not what I'm doing at all. This is why I connect these ideas, in part, to the socialist ideology that underlies a lot of their thought. In the socialist ideology, it's not a giant grand conspiracy that needs to happen. It's simply the using of useful idiots, individuals that have been trained to think in a specific way, so that this horde of people all drive towards one end. And it doesn't matter if you mow some of these people down. They're not a directed entity with one centralized control. They're more like a zombie horde. A zombie horde, of course, who makes more zombies as they move along and take over one section of society or industry or whatever it is that they wish to encompass within their dead-eyed movement towards a goal which they can't even themselves really understand. Now, as I said, this endpoint is a utopian-like society, and this is very fundamental in understanding the way that these people think. Because for most of Western civilization, at the very least, if you look at our mythology, history, and even the major religions, you'll see that most of them have this idea of a golden age, but it happened in the past. So if you go back to something like the myths of ancient Rome and Greece, well, they thought that there was a golden age in the past, and that humanity degraded into the form which they existed in over the years. Or if you look at the major religion, which is Christianity, the idea is of the Garden of Eden. And so there was this perfect existence at one time, which man then fell from. But the point of a progressive ideology is that the golden age exists in the future, not in the past. Now, there are some strains of quote-unquote progressivism which do think there was some kind of golden age in the past and that we need to get back to it. The one that automatically comes to my mind is the gynocentric, noble savage idea that underlies environmentalism. But it's not necessary in their way of thinking. They simply need to put this idea of a mythological golden age in the future and have people move towards that. And the importance of that way of thinking is threefold, and they're all connected. The first being that it breaks completely with what Western civilization has built itself upon. Secondly, it destroys the idea of being a conservative, because a conservative looks backwards to what actually worked in the past. And if you destroy the idea of anything really good being in the past, that all the good is in the future, then you don't get to look into the past and find solutions. You have to look forward. And thirdly, if you can't look into the past to find anything relevant there, at the very least not as relevant as looking into the future, then you can't really use logic and reason in order to support anything that you're trying to argue for. Why? Because the whole point of logic and reason is to look backwards to things that you previously knew, and then either use them, put them together in order to understand something that you didn't understand before, or to use them to disprove that something actually exists because they contradict what you already know to be true. So in such a mindset, you can build this utopian future. It doesn't need to be logical and rational. It can simply be a mythology that exists in the future. And this is exactly what the socialist utopia is. It's not real. It's not logical. It's not rational in any way. The idea is destroyed by logic and reason. It's mythological. And one of the other significant points to make is that this utopian society is just that. It's a society here on Earth. It's a heaven on Earth. It's not like Christianity, where your endpoint is trying to be saved, and so you'll go to a heaven which exists somewhere else, not here on this Earth, or the equivalent of the same thing in ancient religions, where you have to get to Valhalla or Mount Olympus. No, that heaven is most definitely here on Earth. It is the utopia that they wish to progress towards. So some of you may be thinking when I started to talk about retcons that this sounds a lot like 1984. The book, the story. And it does. In that story, you had the Ministry of Truth, where basically they destroyed all of history. Why? Because history had to be constantly rewritten in order to support the political establishment that existed in the here and now. And so, since history was rewritten so many times, and always rewritten by the victor, it no longer exists. Or at the very least, there is no truth to that history at all. And I would say, very much, yes, that's exactly what's going on here, except for the fact that they don't want to support just what is going on now. It is to erase history, both history of things like our entertainment, but also history of our civilization itself, to rewrite it in order to keep their supporters fixed on that utopia in the future so that the power base remains stable. So, after having said all of that, let's go over a couple of examples to show that this is exactly what these quote-unquote progressive people who run entertainment are trying to do. If they are ideologues, if they are truly working for their ideology rather than the company that they work for or anything of the kind, then this is the intermediate endpoint that they are looking to get to at the present time. They're looking to retcon everything. So let's start small and move upwards towards bigger and bigger things. I generally follow Marvel and what they're doing and how they're destroying the comic industry, so I try to keep up on a lot of their articles and their podcasts and everything else. And within a lot of their media, you see bizarre-sounding statements, like the idea of calling Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, an icon. She's an iconic figure. or there was just an article put out by one of the VPs of content for Marvel talking about the Marvel Pride Anthology comics, which she calls groundbreaking. Now, of course, we know from sales numbers or viewership numbers or simply the fact that no one's talking about these properties that no, they're not groundbreaking. No, they're not iconic. But the point being that when you think that, you're defining those words according to the old definition in the past. What these people are doing is they're defining those words according to the utopian definition that is given to it from their mythology in the future. So, if you take that in mind, why in the world would they call a character like Kamala Khan Miss Marvel iconic? Why? Because it's an icon which is leading people towards the utopian future. Why would they say something like the Pride anthologies that no one buys and people laugh about? How are they groundbreaking? Why? Well, it's because they believe that what they're doing with this material is being a trailblazer. That is to say, they're blazing a trail in the entertainment sphere, which, since they work for these giant companies, is going to become the trail that everyone is going to follow. So they are breaking new ground. But again, the whole point is they're breaking new ground to lead to their utopia because they're defining it that way, instead of, as a normal person would, look at groundbreaking and say, this is having a major impact on people. No, it's to have a major impact on people in order to get them to go in the direction they want them to go. And this focus on the future does explain some of the, what I had previously called bizarre statements that came out from Marvel and people who work for Marvel. I watched some interviews with a group of new writers for Marvel. I think it was done about a year ago. I'll link that in the description if I can find it again, where they talk about the fact that, you see, the importance of these people writing these kinds of progressive stories is a future importance. That is to say, it is important because they are opening the door for more and more people like themselves, and more characters like the ones that they're writing, and more stories like they are writing to take over in the future. This would also explain the strange mindset that they have in Marvel Podcast, or used to have at the very least, where they thought, yeah, you see, there is this giant audience just waiting to lap all of this quote-unquote progressive material up. What were they talking about in those two interviews? How do they connect? Well, the point is, what they're trying to do is to shape entertainment in a way that this is the kind of entertainment that you have. They're blazing this new progressive trail, so that's the trail that entertainment is going to take, which of course is supported by these giant companies. So where else are you going to go? And once everybody starts to drive down into this pathway because they're being funneled towards it, then they're going to beat down the path themselves, and this is all that entertainment is going to become. And briefly, I want to go over the perfect example of this exact thing happening. It came from a new article on the Marvel website, which I'll link that in the description if you want to go over and read it. It's fairly short. It is from and about the director of the Eternals movie, because there's a new book coming out about the making of the Eternals movie. And the article itself is the director, Chloe Zhao, discusses the philosophy behind Eternals. And so in this little article, what she does is, first of all, she conflates two ideas. She talks about her story being very human. And so a lot of people would nod their heads and going, yes, sure, a human story, that's great. But then she conflates the idea of human with humanism, basically trying to get the reader to understand that if you accept it that you have a human story, then you must accept that you have a humanistic story. Now, what is humanism? Well, it's basically a philosophical idea that the human being is the center of everything, that your starting point for everything is a human being. Basically, the high point is Descartes with his statement, I think, therefore I am. Therefore, everything exists because of me. Therefore, everything is defined because of me, or at the very least, because of humanity. And this is a philosophical outlook which is contrary to the older philosophical outlook that no, there's a truth that exists, it's bigger than me, and it's bigger than humanity, and therefore we should try to understand what that truth is, where in reality it comes from, and then define things according to that. But the point being is that she moves it into the realm of it's a humanistic story. Now, I know some of you that are subscribed to my channel may be humanists, but then she moves on to link humanism with a very specific kind of humanism. That is to say, progressive humanism. It's not just human beings are the center of everything and they define what truth is. It's that they define what truth is in a progressive way, and that's the correct form of humanism. She does this by linking the idea of humanism with words like representation and talking about the love story which was presented in the Eternals movie as being the driving heart of this movie itself. And then she goes on to talk about why this movie was made and why she was attracted to it to begin with. And she talks about the fact that, well, she gets to define the mythology and the history of the universe itself. Because when she talks about the story itself is that the Eternals go back to the origin of humanity and they help humanity the entire way through its history. And so the mythology and the history of the human race is shaped by these Eternals, and thus the question of being human, which she links with humanism, which she links with progressive humanism, is that how does a person truly become human? Well, this person truly becomes human by expressing progressive humanism, but that's not really the point. The point is encapsulated in one of her statements. She's talking about the guiding of the Eternals of humanity throughout this history, and she says, I think that has changed how we look at some of the heroes in the MCU we've met so far. So basically, what is the Eternals movie? Well, it is a retcon for the MCU itself. That is to say, you have all of these movies, you have all of these characters. They developed pretty much independently, not having a unified philosophy that connected them all. They just wanted to make some money and some good movies. And sure, they threw in some progressive bones now and then in those older movies. But now she's tinkering with the history in order to retcon the history of the entire MCU to say that, yeah, you see, the nature of all of these heroes that you have known up until this point in the MCU has now been changed by me changing the history of the universe, and they're all existing according to progressive humanism. So there's that example. But I want to bring in one more smaller example, a recent example, which highlights this same kind of thinking. It is from the Rings of Power. You had the man who is playing the so-called Black Proto-Hobbit in this show, and he was saying in an interview that we're telling the story now. And first I thought he was saying that we're telling the story now, therefore we get to tell it however we want. That wasn't exactly what he was saying, although other people that have been touting the quote-unquote representation and progressivism of this story were certainly making statements like that. But what his statement was focused on is the fact that in the past, the stories of Tolkien were told for that generation in the past. But we're now telling these stories for the people in the present. And according to his mindset, you have to tell the story completely differently from the original concepts and the original lore and the original history of the stories because you have a different audience. And what he sees as the change in that audience, he talks about in the article where he makes that statement, is the fact that he's been pushing since at the very least 2000 for a more progressive representation in entertainment, and he has gotten there. And therefore, he now sees the audience as a progressive audience that you have to play to, and therefore you must retcon some of what is in the history of these books and the history of these stories because you're telling these stories now for a progressive audience. That is to say, once again, an audience who is looking towards the future. This as a type of mythology, which Tolkien definitely is. He was trying to write mythology for the time and place that he revered, which was the English countryside. These people are now trying to usurp by saying, yes, it's good as a mythology, but we're using it as a mythology that honors our future mythos, not the past that Tolkien was writing for. So, of course, we need to have our progressive audience in the future fix their eyes on this mythological wonder that we are presenting to them of a future utopia by showing them that, yes, even these old ancient mythologies now have progressive strains running straight through them. So, this is a more roundabout way than that article about the Eternals, but it's basically the same thing. They have to retcon all of the mythology of those stories in order to present it to a new audience who has their eyes fixed on the future. Or another way to put it is, there is no such thing as a timeless story. Why? Well, if you have a timeless story, then you can connect through some truth the way people used to think and the way people think now. And if that's the case, then you can find something true within the past. And as such, that would eat away and eventually destroy their utopian mythology of the future. Because it would take some people and get them to look behind them instead of progressing forward. And lastly, I want to give you an example that moves a little bit beyond entertainment itself, but certainly has connections with entertainment. One of these retcons that these quote-unquote progressive ideologues are trying to instill in everyone is a retcon of American history itself. The idea is the 1619 Project. Now, if you don't know what it is, very briefly, it's the idea that America started not on the founding day that you've always been taught, but in 1619. Why? Because 1619 was the date when the first slaves came over from Africa. And so America was built upon slavery, and so that's the inception point of all of America. And that would mean that, of course, the entire country, everything that it is, everything that it was built upon, its history and its future, not to mention its present, is based upon racism and the supremacy of one light-skinned kind of European peoples. Now, a few things to touch on about the 1619 Project. It says, if you go to its Wikipedia page, it is a long-form journalism endeavor developed by Nicole Hannah-Jones, a writer for the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, which, and it quotes her by saying, aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contribution of Black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative. Now, first off, we know that this is bunk history. There was a collection, not a small collection, of actual historians who, after this idea was floated in, I think it was 2019, they came out and said, this is bunk history. This is not American history at all. And of course, from the 1619 Project side, they would claim, no, we're not trying to teach history at all. We're trying to teach how to teach history, which is basically the same end point. But one of the important parts of this is that where does this come from? Well, it comes from critical race theory. Now, you may not have heard of the 1619 Project or think that it has any real impact, but if you've heard of the fact that they're trying to keep critical race theory out of schools, and of course these progressive people are trying to get it into schools as much as possible to teach children the way to think about, well, pretty much everything, this is one of their inception points, to change the entire way that school children learn about American history and replace it with this. Critical race theory, by the way, is a derivation of critical theory. If you look in the book, the literal book where the idea of critical race theory comes from, called Critical Race Theory, the woman who came up with the idea said, yes, I like critical theory very much. I just have to put a racial component to it because all of these white Europeans were coming up with the idea of critical theory. And what is critical theory? It is a Marxist philosophy that is trying to reignite the grand global revolution of Marx. So, once again, tied to this socialist idea of a utopian future. And if you're discussing this with someone and they say they're not trying to teach critical race theory in schools, then say to them, well, then you shouldn't be opposed to us banning critical race theory in schools. And then you'll see the mask come off right away. And as I had mentioned, this does have a connection with the entertainment system because one of the major proponents of the 1619 project, I would say probably second to the woman who created it herself, would be Ta-Nehisi Coates. Ta-Nehisi Coates is the man who wrote the run of Black Panther, which is basically where the Black Panther movie came from. He then wrote Captain America for a number of years, trying to destroy as much as possible when writing that title. And by the way, it looks more and more like the new Captain America movie that is coming out will be based upon his run of the Captain America comics. And on top of that, he was supposed to write the now canceled Superman movie, which would introduce the Black Clark Kent. And he does have a considerable amount of pull. He not only got to work on those projects, but he testified before Congress at one point with, I think, Danny Glover, where he was arguing for slave reparations be paid to all black people in America because basically they built America, which is an idea, of course, that comes from the 1619 Project. So again, a retcon of American history that is worming its way into not only public school systems and the way they teach history, but also into entertainment through comic books and then through movies, and even to an extent that one of its major proponents is testifying before Congress, trying to get them to institutionalize the entire way of thinking. So, what is the point of all of this retconning, not only of history, but of all the stories and mythology that we have as a civilization? Well, the point is to do the exact same thing that they're trying to do with the entertainment system. That is to say, they cracked open that door to allow these people to tell these stories. They're using those stories and that cracked door to bring in as many people as possible to tell more and more stories like this. They then wish to use that with the backing of these mega corporations who are the people who are putting out this entertainment to blaze a trail that no one can ignore. They think that this blazing of this major trail through the entertainment system will draw more and more people towards the easy way, which is to say, you don't blaze your own trail, you don't go looking for something that is niche or something that is going to cost you a lot of effort or time to get through or to get itself because they're banking on people being lazy. And so funnel everyone into this blaze trail, which they will then beat down themselves, and that will be the future of entertainment. And after a while of driving in this direction, they will then use all of those retcons that they used for the history of course, entertainment and possibly of America itself and say, you see, it was always this way. There is no other history but what we present to you. And they are indeed starting to get to that point. And here's where I get to the comment of people saying, well, I have all of my old entertainment. I'm just going to concentrate on that and ignore these people as much as possible. Is that going to work? I don't think it's going to work, or at the very least, not as well as people think it's going to work. Why? Well, because in order to keep people fixed on this future that they hold out to them, this carrot on a stick that they get to use to get people to carry them on their backs where they want to go, they need to eliminate anything which is going to say otherwise. And if you look at how digital everything is becoming, it's going to become very easy for them to try and erase all of the things that you hold dear. Now, I did a video a long time ago about the fact that, sure, you can go on the Marvel Unlimited app and you can go back to those old Marvel stories and read them all there. But some of those stories, even 4 years ago when I did that video, were starting at that time to be changed. There were small things at that time. The fact that you couldn't have Wolverine with a cigarette in his mouth anymore, and therefore they went back and erased that from some of the great runs of the X-Men. And it wasn't limited to the older comics as well. There was a newer Thing comic that came out at the time, which they changed the dialogue in a couple of the panels in one page. That is to say, again, you have this ministry of truth that is going back and changing all of these things. And just to bring up a couple of other things, we know that people who have systems which are not owned by them in their house so that they can record shows, those are owned by the companies, and those companies have in the past erased from those systems things that people have recorded because they weren't allowed to view them anymore. Or the fact that there was a documentary I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head. It was possibly the Dinesh D'Souza documentary, which people were storing on their cloud systems because they wanted to watch it later, and it suddenly just disappeared. Why? Because that's not yours. You don't own that. The digital entertainment system, and really anything that is connected to the internet, is controllable. And so they can erase or change that media on you. The very fact that Windows 10 is now locked up to a point where you can't get at some of your files without the company's say-so if certain things happen, or the fact that you have to buy subscriptions for certain programs in order to get things to work on your computer, it's the fact that no, you don't own access to these things anymore. The companies own the access to these things, even if that's your computer. And even some physical media. Some people might be saying, well, there's always a library. I can just go get the Tolkien books at the library. You want to know how progressive the library system is? You go in and see some of the programs that they have got in your local library, and you'll see exactly how progressive it is, what kind of books they want to put on the shelf, and what kinds of books they are gently taking off the shelves so that they're no longer there. Or people saying, I can go to my local comic store and just get a whole bunch of older comics and I'll read those. There is this trend right now, and it's been there for a couple of years right now, where you have comic pros talking down about anything that is a back issue. Now, why would someone who is writing stories in a comic, when that comic comes out one month and then the next month it goes into the back issue pile, why in the world would they be claiming you should not go and read back issues? Why? Because, of course, they don't want you reading those physical media copies anymore. You're only supposed to concentrate on the present. There was an interview that I covered and talk about a lot with Kelly Sue DeConnick, the creator of the current Captain Marvel as we know her. In this interview, again, which I covered, 2-3 years ago, she was talking about the gatekeeping of comics and how that gatekeeping system started with and continues to be the comic shops. Or if people say, look, we have the internet. People can share these things all over the place. They're never going to kill them. Really? With the hammer of copyright infringement? You don't think some of these people, some of these companies, if they really tried, could extinguish some of these lines of entertainment? And when I say all that, I'm not saying this is what is happening right now. I'm not claiming that this is what is going to happen in the future. I would have to present my evidence if I was going to do that. All I'm saying right now is that these progressive-minded people, if they got their way and had enough power, this is what they want to do. They would destroy and alter all physical and all digital copies of entertainment so that it matches what they want today in order to keep people fixed on their utopian future. And as I said at the first, my point here being that I'm playing the devil's advocate and saying that entertainment that you think that you can rely upon and just go back and enjoy that and ignore all of the stuff that's going on, it's not as reliable as you think it is. Sure, I heartily prompt everyone to go and get physical media, to go and get physical books, physical information if you want to be able to keep it. But at the same time, realize that that's not as secure as you think it is. There are plenty examples of the victors writing history. You could go back to a number of pharaohs and see how they erased the reigns of their predecessors. You could go back to Henry VIII and how he started a government systematized demonization of the ages that came before him to justify the radical changes that came about in his reign. And that little system of propaganda, by the way, kept on going right up until about, I think 1980 before they started to realize, yeah, maybe we should look at some other primary archaeological sources that keep on telling us differently. And honestly, it would not be that hard. For those of you who are listening to me who remember, let's say, the early 1970s, do you remember how hard it was to get information? Do you remember how hard it was to get new kinds of entertainment and not just rely on things that were given to you, pumped into your home, on the radio, on the television? People who have only grown up with digital media don't understand just how hard it was. And all they need to do is bring us back 50 years in the past, and they could have, once again, a stranglehold on any kind of information, whether it be entertainment or not. And quite honestly, with governments starting in some parts of the country and some parts of Europe starting to shut off people's power because of emergencies, I could very easily see governments now saying, well, the internet is a privilege and it uses a lot of power, therefore we're going to cut it off for this section of people. But again, the primary reason why I'm going over all this is to bring to the forefront of everyone's mind just exactly what these quote-unquote progressive people mean when they say things like our heroes are iconic, when they say we're breaking new ground, when they claim to have found the formula for being human and how it involves changing mythology and history, why they believe that no story is timeless and therefore the history of older stories needs to be destroyed for the people of today, why they will no longer abide, you and I, looking up to the heroes of our past, whether they be fictional or historical. But, as I usually try to do, I am going to end, as much as possible, on a positive note, and also remind people that the only way that these quote-unquote progressives can actually get through all of these things that they want to do is through hardship, is through disaster, is through declaring things an emergency. Don't allow them to do so. And the simple way to do that, to counter what they're trying to do, is to be as prosperous as you can. And that can mean many different things for each of us. It can mean being rational and logical in your thinking. It can mean studying and understanding real history. It can mean collecting physical information and media. It can mean doggedly pursuing that thing which makes you happy. It can mean revering those heroes that you've always looked up to, or even simply the idea of hero. All of that, and many more individual pathways, counter their ability to establish and maintain their monolithic but ever-changing progressive version of history. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, if you want a copy of my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, just email me. My email is in the description of this video. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.